house has been completed with no real issues. The only leak I had was a valve cover. On the passenger side, the valve cover gasket started leaking on me, and I removed it, put some sealer on it, put it back. It still leaked. So I ended up pulling it off. It was a steel with a rubber clad type of gasket, and I put cork on it, and I shellacked the gasket to the valve cover, and then I used Permatex Red on the engine side of the gasket. And after I did that, no more leaks. Then there was a air cleaner issue. Turns out that the Holley carburetor sits very low. If you put the air cleaner on without a spacer, it'll interfere with the throttle. So I had to order a spacer from Mr. Gasket. First I went with a 1/2 inch spacer. It was just barely enough to get the air cleaner above the throttle. And I wasn't real happy with it because when I started it one morning, the throttle stuck at about 4,000 RPM. So I assume it was just bumping when it was in the cold position. The choke was cold, bumping the bottom of the air cleaner. So I ordered a 1-inch spacer. However, when I put the 1-inch spacer on the carburetor, it interfered with the choke, and the choke stuck. So I nested the 1-inch and the 1/2 inch together, so I needed a 1.5 inch spacer, which they make. They're not expensive, like 10, 12 bucks. Anyways, I've got 1.5 inch spacer, and I had to get a universal stud to raise that up for the air cleaner, but now there's no interference, and that seems to be okay. The coolant system seemed to be running hot in my first video. And what I did was I just simply went out and bought a $19 water temperature gauge, mounted that on the dashboard, and I pulled the electric one out of the block, and I put in the probe for the little copper tubing, so it's a real good, it seems like a pretty accurate temperature gauge. So instead of running 210 degrees, it's showing about 180 degrees to 190 degrees. I called Pace Performance, and they told me that it had a 195 degree thermostat in it. I don't doubt it. It's probably a little hotter up at the top of the thermostat as compared to down below, because the hot water, I believe, goes in at the top and comes out cool at the bottom. The belt squealing I had when I first started it no longer there. It never did come back. I had some oil on the belt. And the smoking I was getting out of the exhaust manifolds was because I put something called dry graphite on the manifolds, because I saw it on YouTube. It said put that on there and it'll keep them looking good and all that. But it was a ton of smoke for like 45 minutes until it finally burned off. And so I don't think that was did me any good. There is a wound spring here that, as far as I know, is supposed to be the throttle return spring. But there is a place to hook a conventional throttle return spring, and when I hooked up the double spring that was on the old carburetor, you really had to push pretty hard on the pedal, and it didn't feel right. So I took that spring apart, so I have a light duty backup spring here. You don't notice anything different from this driving this car than from the other one, except for the noticeable noise from the exhaust and the fact that it's got a lot of power. These are the gauges I installed in the truck. They're made by Bosch. Temperature gauge and a small tachometer. I couldn't mount the tachometer on the steering column the way the truck's built with a tilt wheel. But well worth it. They're not expensive at all. The tachometer's like $35, and the temperature gauge is only like $19. Well worth the investment. One other thing I have installed here is a light right here. It's a green light that tells me if the torque converter lockup signal is being sent to the transmission, and I will explain that in a moment. But first, over here, the oil pressure gauge seems to function just fine, so I'm still using the original one, and also the voltage for the battery, but I disconnected the water temperature sensor here, which was giving me an inaccurate reading. There are several YouTube videos on here on how the torque converter lockup works on these square body trucks. Some of them are of no use, so one of them was pretty useful. It basically, this is the torque converter lockup vacuum switch right here, and it's an electric switch that switches 12 volts from the ignition and sends it down to the transmission. And it's vacuum operated from a ported vacuum off the carburetor, which my understanding is one up high near the butterfly, and it comes down through a temperature sensor. I took off the old engine so it does not operate when the engine's cold, and then it goes over to there. It also breaks off and goes to the fuel canister, which I'm still using. I used a vacuum tester to check the system before I drove it much, because I wasn't sure any of it was working. That's one of these simple brake bleeder vacuum pump kits I bought at Harbor Freight. I pulled the vacuum on a vacuum line to the torque converter lockup switch, and it would not hold vacuum. That's when I found that the hose was rotted out up near the firewall where you couldn't see it. It's been rotted out for a long time, so I'm assuming torque converter lockup was not working. But with the light, at least I know what's going on, and it all seems to be working. Transmission seems to be working fine. I've got no transmission leaks, no coolant leaks, no power steering leaks. I put a high performance dual exhaust on a truck, and it is fairly noisy. It gives me the feeling that people think I just need a new muffler, because it's not exactly a hot rod. But it's not really that noisy on the highway inside, and although I wished it could be a little quieter, I'm accepting it. I'm going along with it the way it is, because I certainly don't want to do any more changes on the exhaust. And using the original diagram, I hooked up the fuel purge canister to the PCV line and the purge signal to the ported carburetor vacuum line, and I guess it's probably working. Okay, I see no reason why it wouldn't work, but I did add on a little filter here. It's for small engines that I picked it up at Home Depot, because one of the lines seemed to use filtered air from the old air cleaner, so that's filtering the air going into the canister. It's as close to the configuration it was on the old engine. One other item of interest here, and you may be wondering, where did you get the signal to turn on the green light on the dashboard when the transmission goes into lockup? Well, it turns out there's an orange plug that's been laying here. Well, it turns out it's directly wired to the torque converter vacuum switch, and all I can guess is it was a way to hook diagnostic equipment into it to try to test the circuit. And anytime there's 12 volts there, my light will light on the dashboard. Now that doesn't mean the torque converter is actually locked up. It means that the engine is allowing it to lock up. It's saying that the conditions are okay. In other words, the engine is warmed up. I'm not calling for extreme power, that there's sufficient vacuum at the carburetor, which means I'm not, flooring the throttle, and therefore it can go ahead and lock up if the transmission sensors are in a position to do that. So right now the engine is fully broken in. I just finished changing its oil at 500, and now it's good for a normal oil change and filter change. I change the oil on this once a year, and I'm probably only putting about 1,000 miles on it a year the way I use it. It's a little anticlimactic because unless you're going to a car show and people are oohing and ahhing, when you drive up and you say, yeah, I got a new engine, people just go, oh, that's nice, It's like, doesn't mean anything. It's just a truck, it's just running. So, but compared to where I was before and compared to where I am now, it's worlds apart. So unless something occurs that is noteworthy, that's probably all you're going to hear from me on this particular job.